we're very much looking forward to Gavin's talk. I don't know how often he does this, but I felt rather privileged that a wee minion from Friends of the Ellsworth Way managed to.
In that case, Tim, once a year. I only do it once a year. That's
all right. Once a day, once a year is okay. As long as it's an annual event, that's fine. We put it into the calendar. But it's hugely. It's a huge privilege for us to have the opportunity to talk to you. We'll have a reasonable Q&A session afterwards, I hope, because I think you're more interested in getting a flavour from the room as to what people think about the very challenging environment you have to live with on a day-to-day basis. So Gavin is, as you know, the Chief Executive of the Lake District National Park Authority. I caught him just after he'd been back from Dartmoor. I don't know whether you're bringing any lessons from Dartmoor to the meeting today, but I obviously, as a representative of the best national park in the UK, you have big opportunities to tell a story about the successes here. He joined the National Park in 2018 as Head of Programs and Resources, followed by Director of Visitor Sources and Resources, and Services and Resources in 2022, and was appointed the Chief Executive in October, so he's had 7-8 months on the job. His feet are well and truly wet, sodden probably, and he knows everything about the subject. He has a long history of activities linked to local government. He was a public relations officer, which is a good thing, for both Cumbria County Council and Capita. 11 years with Carlisle City Council in policy, community services, and contract management. He is, of course, passionate about increasing understanding of the national park and promoting access. If you take a look at him, you can see he's a fell runner and a bicycle maniac. And actually, for those who want really to get some insight after this talk, you should plug into the Country Stride program done with Mark Richards here. But the interviewer at the time was Dave Felton, who's a sort of friend of our group. Edition 144. Sadly, there are not any in the pipeline, but it's well worth listening. There are?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's good to hear. We can talk more about that. What you're going to talk about is a sensitive topic. This was an article on the front page of the Cumbrian Herald last week. Anger and disgust as fly campers leave trail of destruction. And that's quite a common issue here. And I took the liberty of asking people who were invited here to pose some questions. There were several linked to that. Some are online, some are in the hall, but we'll come to that later, and I'm sure you've got, that's a major concern for you, which you're trying to find a way to address. But without more ado, I would like to pass the floor to you, Gavin. Best wishes. I hope we don't give you too rough a ride, but we're looking forward very much to your insights into the vision, your vision on the future work of the LDNPA. Thank you very much,
Tim. Well, thank you for that. And yes, you know more about my career background than me. That's alarming. I don't remember sending all that in, but yes. A little bit about me personally before I get started to build on what Tim said. So, Cumbrian born and bred. I grew up in Brough over near Kirby Stephen, and spent all of my formative years and sort of grew up in that Eden Valley area, so very familiar with the Lake District and Cumbria, in a place that's close to my heart, and have kind of lived here all my life, short of heading off to university to study. Returned back to Cumbria after that, and as something that will come up when I talk about vision and no doubt in questions, moved up to Carlisle for a period of time, largely due to house prices and wanting to get on the property ladder, and then I've been slowly working my way back towards home since, and now live with my wife and family in T-Bay, right on the fringe of the Lake District, so about half a mile outside the border. We do a lot of collaborative working with other national parks across the country. So as my counterpart in the Yorkshire Dales never ceases to remind me, I do live closer to the Yorkshire Dales than I do to the Lake District. He takes great delight in that, and if it carries on much longer, I'll be looking to move house again just to avoid Mr. Butterworth's barbs. As Tim says, joined the Park Authority about 7 or 8 years ago after a career in local government, and really I was fascinated with the organisation and the role, but as much as anything saw it as another local government job, effectively. Committed as public service as I am, that's kind of how I viewed it at the time, and it didn't take long for the organisation and the place to get pretty deep under my skin, actually, and as you can imagine, I have good days and bad days and some challenging evenings out in the community as well, but I wouldn't change it for the world, and it's been an absolute privilege to be appointed to the Chief Exec of the Park Authority, and I genuinely think it's one of the best jobs in the world, so I'm very fortunate to have it. Really look forward to sessions like this, and as Tim says, although I'll drone on a little bit for a PowerPoint, the bit that I really enjoy about these sessions tends to be the discussion and the Q&A afterwards, and I am all ears. I genuinely enjoy hearing your concerns, your questions, your observations, and having a discussion with you, and then taking those issues back to the ranch and trying to get the team to do our best to address them. Moving on to my presentation, I'm going to start with a bit of scene setting around the Park Authority itself, and as I look around the room, I can immediately tell there's a mixed audience in terms of familiarity with the authority, ranging from people who are either currently or have served as members on our board through to perhaps people who don't know that much about our work. What I have learned as I've engaged with parish councils and local communities and tried to get out and be a bit more visible in the park is there is a really mixed understanding about what the role of a National Park Authority is, the services we're responsible for, the powers that we have, and how the whole local government ecosystem functions within Cumbria. It can be a bit of a confusing environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit to begin with. If I can get my clicker to work, which I can't, Joe.
Well, bear with us. Set you up to fail there, sorry.
The on button. I used to head up the IT department, would you believe? Yes, I don't know where the on switch was. National parks in context, I won't spend much time on this, but the Lake District, as everyone here I'm sure is familiar with it as a place, no doubt live locally, work locally, or at least love the place, but one of 15 national parks in Great Britain, and one of the first to be designated back in 1951. It's the largest national park in England at 900 square miles, or just over 2,300 square kilometres in modern money. I'm not going to read them out, but yeah, put it in context. 15 national parks, 10 in England, 3 in Wales, a couple up in Scotland. The governance arrangements are a little bit mixed, but broadly the purposes and the functions of the park authorities that run them are all the same. I'm not going to run through all these stats and figures, but I'm happy to share some of the slides with the audience afterwards, Tim. But incredible places, national parks, just 10% of the land cover of England, and yet 50% of the most protected habitats and the most protected ecosystems in the UK. 325,000 residents in national parks and 24,000 businesses, but a combined economy of £15 billion. They've got the potential to restore over 320,000 hectares of peatland, to massively increase tree cover. They have a significant role to play in protecting and conserving the natural environment. And also a really important role to play, as I'll come on to when I speak later, in terms of cultural heritage and the agricultural sector, as well as the visitor economy. Again, all sorts of facts and figures that I'm sure people in the room are really familiar with about the Lake District itself. England's largest national park, home of the highest mountain, home of the largest lake, the deepest lake. And some of the numbers down the bottom here that I'm sure will be a point of discussion later on are really significant visitor economy here in the Lake District and Cumbria as well. About 40,000 residents and getting on for 17, 18, 19 million visitors every year. Crucial, £1 billion economy generated by that, but I'm sure, as we'll discuss at times, challenges and pressures associated with that as well. The National Park Authority, the organisation I lead and represent, is the local government organisation tasked with the management of the national park, effectively, at its simplest. We have 20 members on our board, just over 200 staff, so quite a small organisation. Massively supported by over 450 volunteers that I don't go anywhere without singing the praises of and speaking of. I'm sure everyone's aware of the work of Fix the Fells and our volunteer walk leaders, archaeological network as well. We've got so many talented people who support the National Park Authority and help us fulfil our purposes as volunteers. On our board that I spoke about earlier, we have 20 members. 10 of them are appointed by the local authorities here in Cumbria, so 4 from Cumberland Council and 6 from Westmoreland and Furness. And we have 10 members of the board appointed by the Secretary of State, so appointed by Steve Reid at the moment. 5 national members, where there's a national application process, and these individuals are selected on their knowledge, their experience and their skills, and are placed on the boards by the Secretary of State on that basis and to help us manage the park. And 5 parish council nominated Secretary of State appointments. So that's a little bit confusing because we've got effectively 15 members drawn from local authorities, 10 of them directly appointed by the 2 unitary authorities here in Cumbria, and then 5 come through parish council representation, and the Cumbria Association of Local Councils effectively has an electoral college and a school to elect them and put them onto our board. And that mix is meant to reflect the dual purposes of national parks as well, that they are living, breathing, working communities where you guys live and work, but are also designated in the national interest as well. These are the green spaces, the blue spaces, the open air for the entire nation to enjoy as well. And that balance of national and local representation is meant to reflect those dual purposes of a national park. Phrase not ours but ours to look after is an interesting one. We have a truly British or English model of national parks. You'll not find it replicated anywhere else in the world. The point we're making here is you have a national park authority. We're tasked with managing the national park. I'll come on to our purposes in a moment. But we're expected to do so despite not owning any of the land in the national park particularly. We're something of an oddity and a rarity, the Lake District National Park Authority. We're quite a large landowner as a national park authority, and we own about 4.5% of the Lake District. And as I say, by National Park Authority standards, we're a big landowner. So we don't own the land. We are responsible for very, very few statutory services. When it comes to statutory service provision, at our core, we're the planning authority. That's it. We're not the highways authority, we're not the transport authority, we're not the housing authority. Our statutory role and responsibilities is limited to the planning function. So we don't own the land, and we have very few statutory or regulatory powers. We are fortunate enough, I'll say on the record, to get about just under £6 million of government grant, and as again I'm sure will be a point of conversation later on in the Q&A. We're also probably one of the more commercially focused national park authorities in terms of generating our own income as well, which gives us a total budget of typically between 12 and 15 million pounds a year, which at a community level sounds like a vast amount of money, but when you're trying to manage 900 square miles of national park is really not a lot of money at all. So, it's getting a bit depressing this, isn't it? Although I am really enthusiastic about my work. We don't own the national park, we have very few statutory responsibilities, and we've got a tiny budget. And yet it's our job and a requirement, as you'll see at the bottom of this, to produce a holistic management plan for the whole national park and to fulfil 2 statutory purposes that we have. So although we don't have statutory powers or statutory obligations in terms of service delivery, what we are expected to do by government on a statutory basis is to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the Lake District, and promote opportunities for the understanding and enjoyment of the special qualities of the national park. So we've got all that to do, as I say, with relatively few levers to pull, which begs the question how we go about doing it. We know we've got that statutory obligation to write that management plan for the park, and beyond a statutory obligation, all our members, all our staff are truly passionate about the place. We want to write a management plan that's progressive and delivers for residents and visitors alike. But we know that we're limited in our powers, budgets and responsibilities to do that. So in order to fulfil that obligation, we pulled together an organisation called the Lake District National Park Partnership. I'm not going to read all those logos out to you, but in theory, at its simplest, what it's trying to do is pull together the organisations that do own the land, that do have the powers and that do have the money to make a difference in the Lake District and to shape the place for the future. We pull them together under a partnership, which operates a lot like a family. We have good days and bad days. We get along famously. We have our squabbles, but we work together to try and draft a management plan for the national park, and then we work together to try and deliver that management plan. That management plan sets out a range of outcomes and objectives that we're seeking to deliver over the medium and long term, and also articulates the vision for the national park, which, as things stand, is that it would be an inspirational example of sustainable development in action, where the world-class visitor experience, the prosperous economy and the vibrant community come together to sustain the spectacular landscape, wildlife and cultural heritage. That's our current vision. That's on the front page of our existing management plan that, as I say, we have an obligation as a park authority to lead, but which we develop in partnership. We have to review that plan every 5 years, and we're midway through that process now. The next management plan we'll have to approve and put into motion from 2026. So not only do we have a new management plan to write at the moment, and we're halfway through that process at the moment with our partnership, but the eagle-eyed of you will notice that our vision as it stands is up to 2030. That was the timescale that we looked forward to when we set this vision 10, 15 years ago. We have to review the management plan every 5 years, and it has to be a sort of 5-year cycle. And given that it'll come into action in 2026, that next plan will take us through to 2031 and beyond the lifespan of the current vision. So as well as reviewing the plan and coming up with a new plan, we're also about to embark on creating a new vision for the national park, which is kind of what we're here to talk about tonight, really. I won't bore you with the process, but the way we do that is we pull together a series of evidence papers. There's a load of workshops with our partners. There's public consultation. And we're aiming to put together some long-term ambitions for the park, some medium-term objectives, and then some short-term actions to take us towards the ambitions that we've set. In order to do that, we pulled together some key thematic areas that are the structure of the existing plan at the moment, key areas that we know we've got issues that need to address or that are core to the special qualities of the park as things stand. And we started to look at the challenges and pull together the evidence that we know exist in those areas so that we can start to think about what the ambitions for the next 25 years should be. One of those key areas was around nature and land management. We know the spectacular landscape of the Lake District is absolutely what makes it such a special place. We know that nature's critical to it. We're also acutely aware that there is a national nature crisis and a need for nature recovery, and the Lake District isn't exempt for that. Nature could be doing better here in the Lake District and could be thriving more than it is. I don't take the rather bleak view that we are in some way an ecological disaster zone or that we're somehow worse than the rest of the country. I think the key point here is there is a national crisis in terms of nature and biodiversity, and the whole country is going to have to play its part in putting that right. But protected landscapes and places like the Lake District should do some of the heavy lifting of that and should be at the forefront of that. There's been work going on for a period of time now on the Cumbria Local Nature Recovery Strategy, and we're acutely aware through that there are key species in the Lake District that are in decline, and many of our habitats and our most special and our most protected habitats, the SSSIs, the sites of special conservation, are in poor condition, and more action is needed to bring them back into the condition that we'd all like to see them be in. I don't need to speak for long in this room about water quality. Anyone who's local, works, lives, visits, knows the issues that we've got around water quality in the Lake District. Again, this is not a unique or uncommon thing around the rest of the country, but I do believe water quality probably needs to be at the heart of our next management plan. There is something of a clue in the title of our national park. We are the Lake District, and if we don't have our water quality quite right, I don't think it's much of a concern what the rest of the country's water quality state is. I think it has to be a priority for here. Woodland cover is below the national average as well. We've got about 8 or 9% woodland cover in the Lake District, and really national averages would be a lot higher than that. I'm not too keen at times to compare ourselves with other parts of the world. You're not always comparing like with like, but in mainland Europe that figure can be much closer to 20%, and we've got quite a low woodland cover. A couple of opportunities. The shift in government policy towards environmental land management beyond basic payments for farmers has opened up a whole range of landscape recovery approaches, and it's really providing new funding opportunities. But on the negative side, any of you that are closely related to or work in agriculture and the farming sector know that the other grant schemes are really difficult at the moment, and uncertainty around policy direction and availability of funding for farmers and land managers is a real challenge if we're going to make improvements for nature. Another key area of climate. The scale of change that's expected through to 2050 and beyond is going to be significant and greater here in the Lake District than it is elsewhere in the UK. The modelling expects that that as climate changes, and some of that is baked in now, the climate is changing even if we cut our emissions, the impacts somewhere like the Lake District are more extreme. So the pressure's on, and there is a threat to our environment, there's a threat to economies. I absolutely, in this locality, don't need to tell anyone about the impact of flooding on local communities. The pace of decarbonisation needs to be considerably stepped up. We were at the forefront of setting a carbon budget on a place-based basis in the Lake District 8, 9, 10 years ago. And the trajectory that we set ourselves in terms of carbon emissions reductions in order to get to net zero by 2035, which was Cumbria's ambition, despite all our best efforts, we're not on track for that at all. And actually, since we revised the budget in 2019, realistically, emissions aren't really falling at anything like the pace that we would need to. So a journey to net zero would require significant commitment from all sectors. But I think these last couple of points are really important as well. Adaptation and resilience is going to be needed already. Without sounding too doom and gloom, there is a degree of climate change that's baked in and coming our way now. We have to start thinking about land management and community protection and natural flood management to protect us from what's already baked in. Optimistically, I think we can do that, but we'll need to start to make progress fairly quickly, and it's got to be high on the agenda in the coming years. Communities and our economy. I'm going to rattle through some of these because I think they'll be quite familiar to you, but young people and families are being priced out of the housing market, and that is one of the factors in a declining population. We need more affordable, locally prioritised housing to maintain vibrant communities. There's clear evidence that once you fall below a certain level of year-round occupancy with certain demographics in communities, it starts to have a real impact. And again, I'm sure that story is familiar to some of you that live here. We need investment to upskill and retain a skilled workforce locally if we're going to have an economy fit for the future. The visitor economy plays a significant role in that, and a really important role. Its scale and size within the Lake District and the Cumbrian economy just can't be understated. It is a real key source of employment, and the supply chain that it supports is critical. But we also need to acknowledge that there's a greater need than ever for strategic management of visitor pressures that can come with visitor numbers as well. I'll happily take questions and talk about this later on, but you will know that there's been a shift since COVID, and actually, to a large extent, I really welcome the demographic shifts that we've changed and the change in visitors that we've seen, but with it has come a change in patterns of behaviour in terms of the places they visit, the activities that they want to do, and at times how they behave when they're here as well, and that's a real challenge that we're acutely aware of and we know will need addressing. And the digital infrastructure, increasingly important for growth, for access, for resilience, and for how all of us just live our lives daily now, and yet we've still got patchy connectivity across Cumbria and the Lake District. Farming is, again, absolutely one of our special qualities as a national park, as well as one of the attributes of outstanding universal value that led to us being designated as a World Heritage Site. But traditional hill farming systems are at real risk of collapse at the moment without further intervention. There's a real downward trend in farm income since the exiting of the European Union and the move away from common agricultural policy and the implementation of ELMS schemes, so public payment for public good. It's a principle at the National Park Authority we really support, and we think it's a mechanism that can really help sustain farming and lead to nature recovery. But the problem at the moment is the transition and the systems, in our view, aren't working effectively. They're not available, the funding isn't accessible, and land managers and farmers can't get into the schemes on a sustainable basis. That leads to a knock-on impact on support services, the wider economy. There's still an important central role that agriculture plays in supporting rural economies, even in Cumbria where you've got such a strong visitor economy. We shouldn't understate the knock-on impacts when our agricultural sector starts to suffer. We do need to understand better the loss of our small family-owned farms and the impact of abattoir closures. The funding landscape, again, I'm sure I'll get questions about this, but it is absolutely labyrinthine. And when you're working from morning to night just trying to run your farm and manage your land, the concept of getting your head around the funding landscape at the moment is incredibly challenging. And we believe the importance of farming in delivering public goods is undervalued. That traditional land management, yes, some land management changes will be needed, but that traditional approach to farming, if adapted to be done in a nature-friendly way, and Ullswater is one of the best valleys across the Lake District and across Cumbria for examples of this, it really starts to deliver the public goods that the government want to see: natural flood resilience, water storage, climate change mitigation. Farming can play a critical role in this. Our historic environment will be an important part of our next plan as well. We're a significant area nationally and internationally for historic and cultural environmental designations. We have a real paucity of skilled craft skills in key areas. So some of the wonderful features of our heritage, whether it's dry stone walling, whether it's shard fencing, I was lucky enough to visit around Ambleside. These are wonderful heritage features, and there's a real shortage of skills to maintain them and look after them. So investment is needed to remove our remaining sites from our heritage at risk register that we have to maintain as a local authority. But we also need to better understand the conservation areas and listed building management needs. And increasingly there's research to show, I think most people are increasingly aware of the health benefits that come from engaging in the natural environment, being outdoors and enjoying nature. But increasingly there's evidence to show that engagement with the historic environment is really important for health and well-being as well. Moving on to people and the centrality of people to the National Park. The National Park is meant to be for everyone, but at times research shows that not everyone feels welcome in the national parks, and we've certainly got concerns that high costs and the lack of public transport may inhibit lower income visitors and may inhibit younger visitors coming to the national park, as there's increasing trends to not own cars, private cars, and as we all know, it's pretty central to transport modes within the Lake District at the moment. Real opportunity to promote the health benefits of getting out in the outdoors, which I've spoken about already, and probably a need to diversify employment opportunities and have a broader economy across the Lake District. And we certainly think that longer term adequate funding is needed for the public rights of way across the park and associated infrastructure. We, as many of you'll know, are responsible for maintaining the rights of way. It's actually a local authority function, so Cumberland Council and Westmoreland Furness councils are statutorily responsible for that. We do it effectively under contract and under licence. And we do so, we're very grateful to receive funding from the two councils, but we receive a really, really small amount of funding from them, and we spend quite a large proportion of our national park grant maintaining those footpaths. We think that's the right thing to do in the Lake District because they are such a central part of that iconic landscape, but the current model isn't probably sustainable over the next coming years with the trends in funding for the National Park Authority. So we need to find a long-term and adequate funding source for that piece of work. Something that I know people are passionate about in this valley, transport. Without significant interventions investment, the car is likely to dominate. We know that's the case in all valleys. There's been some great work locally done here and some really exciting work done, but car travel remains the predominant way of moving around the Lake District and certainly getting to and from the National Park. If we're going to change that, the funding needs to be significant and long-term. There's some great examples of smaller schemes and trials and pilots happening, and I don't belittle them at all, but the sustainability of them and the replicability of them is a real challenge. And if we really want to move the dial on transport, we're going to have to be serious as partners at local and at central government level around the funding needs for that. Rail isn't playing the role it could, but I think the next two, if I'm a pragmatist over the next 5 to 10 years, although we'll continue to lobby and advocate for improvements in the rail network, it's these next two that feel most realistic if we're going to make changes in the Lake District, which is about expanding and promoting accessible routes and encouraging more active travel, and crucially improving the frequency, the availability, the reliability and the cost of bus services. We know that people without a car struggle to access the area for both leisure and work. And to reach our 2037 net zero target, decarbonisation across transport is going to be important as well, so public transport has a role to play in that. So moving on to that next plan, that document we're working up at the moment, we're going to structure it, we're likely to structure it at least around 4 key themes. It can be difficult to sort of crowbar those myriad of issues I've spoken about into these quite narrow silos. And in truth, although I like them, we may have chosen different ones, but in all honesty, Natural England issue guidance on how you should structure your management plan for a national park, and they strongly recommend you should use these 4 titles. So in theory, we are at liberty to structure it in a different way, but when central government are giving us strong guidance, we tend to take heed of that. And in truth, the structure of the plan, for me at least, isn't the most exciting bit. It's the content that really matters, not the headings that you put it under necessarily. So our emerging vision for the park, the bit where it gets quite exciting as we look forward to 2051. We have a draft vision statement at the moment that we're discussing with our partners across the partnership. I'm not going to reveal that yet, because you can imagine even within the partnership it's a fairly hotly debated conversation, and the passion behind the words, the individual commas, the spacing in that vision statement is quite something to behold. So until the partnership have agreed on a draft for consultation later in the year, I'm not going to reveal it verbatim, but I can reveal the ingredients of the vision, and it is likely to focus on the value of the Lake District to the nation and how we hope that it is respected, cherished and loved by all. It's going to focus on celebrating a thriving working landscape and a vibrant economy. On the Lake District being nature and heritage rich and have a really strong focus on nature recovery, and on us being climate resilient and storing more carbon than we emit. As you'll see, that is a long-term vision. That is where we want to see the national park in 2051. Ahead of that, there are some emerging ambitions, the more nearer term things that we want to see achieved. And that's about restoring habitats and enhancing them, seeing species recovering and enabling nature to flourish in a more joined up landscape. About seeing water pollution reduced and more natural processes restored, and improvement in our water quality and the water supply for people and nature. That carbon emissions have been reduced and that the national park as a whole is starting to sequester carbon and suck more carbon out of the atmosphere than it emits. That the whole park is resilient to the effects of future climate change and the threats from flooding, and that we achieve that through an increase in natural management solutions, an increase in woodland and tree cover, restored peatland and re-wetted wetlands for water storage. That the Lake District is really contributing to the nation's well-being, and that people who visit are inspired to look after and enjoy the landscape and to visit responsibly and sustainably. And that public transport and active travel become the preferred ways of moving around the park, at very least, if not getting to the park, but moving around the park, and that we make real efforts to allow more people to get where they need to go, when they need to go, without over-reliance on private vehicles. That the working age population has grown and that we are sustaining really thriving communities and a diverse economy and supporting people to live and work here. and that profitable and nature-friendly farming produces quality food and makes its contribution to both the climate and nature crises, but at the same time protects the unique agricultural processes that make this place really special, in particular the hefted flocks and the system of farming that we've had in the Lake District for millennia. And finally, the cultural landscape and historic environment is conserved or enhanced, ensuring it's better understood and looked after for generations. They're effectively the emerging ambitions that we have for the park and the backbone and the structure of the future management plan that we're working on at the moment. We'll be finalising that within our partnership in the coming weeks and months, and then going out to public consultation. So we're really looking forward to hearing the views of the people who live, work and visit the Lake District. And I'm sure I'll get a bit of a preview of that tonight in the questions and in the comments that follow. But that for me, Tim, probably concludes the PowerPoint, and we can get into the bit that I was looking forward to, which, as I say, is that conversation and discourse. So I'll say thank you very much.
Not a single or grunt or anything. It's just
It's almost like a practice, Tim, isn't it?
magnificent. I mean, the level of articulateness is just outstandanding, I would say. Apart from the vision and the content of the rest, just the way in which you handle it, I was very much in admiration of your approach. I don't know whether that view is shared by others. I think we're in good hands. There's a huge smorgasbord of different things that you are challenged to find some answers to. We have a session now focused on questions from the hall, questions from our Zoomers. I forgot to welcome the Zoomers. To prepare this section, I asked people who had registered here if they would like to propose some questions. So I have some reserved questions, and maybe I'll put them higher up the list as well. But before going to the people already drafted various questions, maybe we can kick off fresh from the hall here if there are any direct questions you would like to raise already. Yes, could you introduce yourself? And I'll also circulate with a microphone or ask someone else to do it. It's very difficult for the Zoomers, so please be succinct and clear.
Okay, my name's Hugh Povey, live just the other side of Penrith, so strictly speaking, not in the park. Just wondering what the Park Authority's attitude is to a tourist tax, how you would implement it, if you did it, or would you just be afraid that the government would remove funding to compensate for every pound you raised?
I'm pleased to see we're warming up with the nice, easy, gentle questions. So
you will know that other people have already addressed this, because there's someone on the line who raised very similar question.
Yeah.
There's also Miles here who's... do you want me to add your question, or maybe you'd like to make it yourself?
Well, you've covered them all really nicely. I mean,
we're going through this process just to make sure that our Zoomers can hear.
I mean, given that your funding from government is by no means assured, do you not think it's inevitable that there'll have to be some form of visitor charge? We get 18 million visitors. If they all paid £1 a day, your problems are solved. A bed tax, I've just come back from Italy, and we happily pay €3 a night staying in a hotel. But of course, the majority of the visitors to the park are day visitors, and we just wondered whether you feel that inevitably, sooner or later, there'll have to be some form of visitor charge.
Thank you. So, the whole story about charging, it's a contentious issue.
must be time for coffee break.
Is there a line that you're pushing as the
There isn't.
The boss?
I think the first thing to say, it's quite difficult for me to answer the question directly, because neither the partnership or the authority have taken an absolute position on this. So although I'm the chief executive, I've also got to follow the lead of the board and present the authority's position. I'll certainly give some thoughts on the complexities of the debate and some personal views as well. I've got no problem with that at all. I certainly recognise the challenge we face as a park authority in terms of our funding, and it's not just us. As you'll have probably gathered from my presentation, it's a real partnership effort to manage the National Park. It doesn't all sit and fall on the National Park Authority. In fact, we act more often than not as convener, as coaxer, as cajoler, as encourager, as influencer, rather than as a direct service delivery. So it's not just our funding situation that's pretty pressured. The two local authorities as well are under acute pressure and want to achieve great things for the National Park and for the county, just as the Park Authority does. So I think an obvious starting point would be, I think the absolutely preferred solution is if national parks are for the nation, then the funding for those bodies should reflect the fact that they are national parks. If we look at things like transport funding, the formula currently is largely predicated on the resident population. So in Cumbria, you end up with transport funding for 500,000 people or so. You extrapolate that down if you can do such a thing, or you narrow it down, and in the Lake District we're receiving funding for the 42,000 or so people that live here, not the 18 million visitors that come every year. I think the first point that needs addressing is the nature of the funding model for local authorities and for national park authorities in areas that have a high visitor economy. I certainly regret the loss of funding through National Park Grant. In real terms, we're 53% down on the National Park Grant that we were receiving in 2010, although I really welcome the capital injection that DEFRA have made. So I would certainly welcome additional funding, and as a revenue generator, I certainly think there are vehicles through visitor charge in whatever mode or model that you would apply that could raise significant sums, obviously. 18 million would certainly help with my budget deficits, Miles, but in truth it wouldn't go that far across the national park, would it? Which leads me to my first concern, and I know at the sort of price point you were pitching at, it's probably not such a concern, but although it wasn't explicit in the 1949 Act, at least in my head, the sort of Attlee government movement post-war that established national parks at the same time as the National Health Service was established, I think there is something precious about them being national parks and being free at the point of access almost. So although I don't think that precludes forms of charging, ultimately if you visit the national park, I know better than any, for most people you have to pay to park in one of our car parks or someone else, so it isn't free at the moment. I don't pretend it is, but I certainly wouldn't want to see there be significant economic barriers to people from low socio-economic barriers. I certainly wouldn't want it to become an exclusive place that the whole nation can't enjoy. So that's one of my first reservations. I think any solution would really have to make sure that it didn't become a barrier for people coming and enjoying their national park. And then we get into some of the legislative difficulties. There's no vehicle at the moment for occupancy taxes or bed taxes. That would require primary legislation. The only realistic solution that could be enacted with powers that are in place at the moment is probably congestion charging. And although that possibly has a greater degree, and it is relative, but a greater degree of equity in my mind in terms of who's paying for it, in terms of who derives enjoyment from the Lake District and benefit from it, I think the capital costs and the application in an area like the Lake District could be pretty challenging, and I would leave that to the transport authorities to look at. And then I also think there's something around as well, the timing just at the moment, although I think the time's ripe and we probably do need to have a grown-up conversation around these things, and we are starting to do that through the partnership, certainly at looking at options for funding for sustainable transport, and that goes beyond just visitor charging, but visitor charging is part of a working group that we've got looking at funding models for sustainable transport. But I think we've also got to keep in mind there's at least reasonable probability, or certainly possibility, that we have a mayoral combined authority come May in Cumbria. And I think if you get the devolution deal right and you get the funding formula right for transport in Cumbria and Lake District, then that might put a different slant on the requirement and need for visitor charging. The final part of the question that I did find interesting, do I think there's a degree of inevitability about it? I don't know is the honest answer, Miles, but there's certainly there's a shift in sense nationally, isn't there? Pre-comprehensive spending review, you saw a number of mayoral combined authority mayors, so Steve Rotherham, Andy Burnham and others, effectively lobbying for mayoral combined authorities to to be given the powers to implement visitor charges. I think in the most case, those that have pushed hardest for it are actually authorities that typically, as an example, have an A bid and are actually interested in generating more tourism and increasing visitor numbers. So that's something to be conscious and aware of. But also, what I will then go on confidently to say is I do have, unsurprisingly, quite clear views on how the money should be used if you got to a position where a mayoral authority did have the powers to implement any form of visitor charge and wished to do so, and that's that in protected landscapes, a good chunk of that money should be hypothecated and used to further the purposes of national parks. I am magnanimous enough to say it doesn't all have to go to the National Park Authority, although I would love to see some of it do so, but it should certainly be used in the furtherance of those statutory duties that we've got, which are to promote the conservation and protection of the wildlife, cultural heritage and natural beauty, and to promote understanding and enjoyment of the place. Final thing I'll say on this as well is the other thing around the bed tax, and I'm sure those of you involved in the tourism industry, again, whether it would act as a barrier or not is a really hot debate, and I think we'd need some primary research on that. But I do know the last couple of years have been more difficult than perhaps people realise for the tourism sector in the Lake District and more widely. And when you look elsewhere in the world, you're not always comparing like with like. The most simple observation would be around some of the European countries where visitor overnight taxis are commonplace. The VAT rates on the hospitality section are typically down at 10% rather than the 20% here at the UK. So the overall tax take might not be that different in these European places, but how it's divvied up and how it's allocated is quite different. What is happening in those places abroad that have tourism tax is it is securing the money and putting it in locally. But whether I see any realistic prospect of the Treasury wanting to have a discussion about varied VAT rates across the country, I think that's really quite challenging.
May I suggest, I mean, this is a very sensitive and difficult topic, but it's been on the table for years, I mean, decades even, but I think there's a sense that the mood is changing. We have in this room people who are very much involved in Situ, and you probably know them as well. Situ, the Sustainable Integrated Transport for Ullswater, who've done a huge amount of work on trying to get the sort of things that you're looking for off the ground. We like to think Ullswater is a potential model and a pioneer, and it just needs more resources and more energy from the powers that be to give it the oomph to allow it to get to the next stage. Some amazing work has been done by the community. I just wonder whether the people, I'm looking at various faces, are people who are involved in the notion of creating charges to support transport, you know, on a value basis, maybe, is a topic worth people just saying a few more words on. I don't know whether...
But on that, Tim, particularly the congestion charging idea, I mean, legislatively it's required that that goes back in effectively to transport, so you'd actually see that.
Yeah, I understand you can ring-fence money of that sort. This is what our legal advice told us at one stage. Do anyone from CETA want to say something on this? No?
Thank you. Deal with Tim's observations first, and I have a question as well. We've been looking at how to raise money for what we want to do, obviously. We did consider looking at an accommodation bid scheme along the lines of, I think Manchester's got one, yeah. Edinburgh might have one, I'm not sure. But the difficulty with that is that, as I understand it, it has to be raised through the rate system. Yeah. And I think there would be some resistance to that because business rates are already very high. And it's very difficult, I think, to get the direct link between what has to be raised through the rate system and what can be raised from individual visitors to the Lake District. So we sort of shelved that idea because it was getting quite complicated.
it comes back to the point that there is no legislation for that overnight bed tax as such, and what's going on in places in Manchester is effectively a proxy for that. It is a business improvement district and accommodation bid, so it's exactly that. They effectively use a formula to work out the occupancy of the hotels and what they would have to pay at £1 a night or whatever the charge would be, and then they apply an uplift to the business rates of the businesses within the area, and that's how they effectively produce a proxy for a tax on the visitor, but it's more a tax on the business itself. And then the crucial part about the bid process and the bid mechanics as well is the funding of that is then held by the bid board and spent by the bid board on the activities that they want to pursue. So it doesn't go back to the public purse or to public authorities or councils or whatever. It sits within the A bid in the case of Manchester, or for those of us in Cumbria that are more familiar with typical business improvement districts, it's just the same mechanics effectively.
That aspect is very attractive, because I think any visitor charging scheme that comes into effect, the big questions are, how is it collected, and then how is it spent? And the how is it spent is very important, because who decides how it's spent? And the one attractive thing about the bid scheme is that the bid board itself decides. As I said, it looked too complicated for us to try and do here. So what we've been looking at instead is ways of generating voluntary income from visitors. We've recently, this year, started asking accommodation providers if they put on their booking forms a voluntary donation from visitors. We'll see how that goes. Another obvious way of getting money from day visitors is through parking. And I don't know whether that's something that the Lake District is looking at. The observation I was going to have based on your talk, which thank you very much, I love some of the ambitions, particularly the transport-related ones, which are the ones I'm interested in. But what is then the plan for converting the ambition into action?
That will follow later, and we're not at that process. We're not at that point in the process yet. We haven't collectively pinned down and got 100% agreement on those. Hence the word emerging. If anyone missed it, I will restate that before I offend my colleagues across the partnership. They are our emerging objectives. Once we get them firmed down, we then drafted effectively an action plan, a delivery plan in the short term to move us towards those objectives. So that comes next in the process as we develop the management plan.
Can I just ask, is there going to be an interminable debate, or is it going to reach a point when a decision is made? You know, someone bites the bullet, whether it's a politician or a group or
well, I hope we don't get to too much
or does it just go on and on and on and kicked into touch?
No, it can't be an interminable debate. We come back to the point, it's a really strange thing, the management plan, because to have any hope of delivering it, we develop it in partnership. As I explained at the beginning, realistically there'd be no other way of delivering it, even if there were other ways of developing it. But concurrently, it's also a statutory document and a requirement of the Lake District National Park Authority. We have to have a management plan for the National Park Authority, and we're required to approve it. And we've got till October 2026 at the very, very latest to do that, because by then the existing management plan will have elapsed, and if we haven't approved another one, we won't have a management plan. So by hook or by crook, we have to adopt it by October 26. Let's hope it doesn't get to locking the partnership in rooms until we leave as such. I've actually been...
smoke.
Yes. Well, it'll be carbon neutral, so we'll have to find lights or something, but I'm actually impressed. I'm actually impressed with the degree of consensus that we've moved towards as a partnership already. We as a board went away as long ago as last November and started to think about, almost in splendid isolation, what did the Park Authority want to see in the next management plan, and we wanted to handle that process really sensitively, because we didn't want to come up with the ideas that we wanted to see in the management plan and then turn up to the partnership and then feel like it wasn't a consultative and collaborative process. So we let them know what we were doing, but we largely kept it in our back pocket till the end of the first meeting of the partnership, and when we compared the two documents, even at the start, there was a remarkable amount of consensus on a lot of those key issues. This is one of the things that can frustrate me and encourage me in my job at times. There's a lot more consensus on a lot of issues than perhaps we give ourselves credit up for. And we tend to focus on the areas where stakeholders are disagreeing, when in truth there's a lot of consensus on a lot of issues.
Let's move to another topic, which this is from Andy Butcher, known locally as the Swan Man. He's listening in on Zoom. It's about fly camping, littering, lighting fires. You're all damaging our beautiful places. Your strategic visitor management group since 2020 meets every 3 weeks and is represented by all sorts of agencies and authorities. Still, we see nothing has changed. We note that the Cumberland Council have a Public Spaces Protection Order, PSPO, in place to cover areas that they have jurisdiction over, such as Wasdale and Buttermere. Currently, Westmoreland and Furness have no plans to put a PSPO in place until next year. But if they did, it would be a start. What does your authority propose to address this serious problem, which is in our media almost permanently?
I'm Pete Henley on the front page of the Herald. And as you know, we litter pick regularly. I'm litter picking.
Just a minute.
I'm litter picking Hatton Fell once a week. I am.
Just a minute, because we want everyone to catch.
So I'm litter picking most days. I've come almost around my full-time job, where you have met me previously. I litter pick. I break down all the fire pits. I deal with the fire damage. We pick up bags of human feces. It is beyond out of control now. It really is. I personally started writing to Tim Farron about this issue last August, so I'm a year deep into this now. It's intimidating for other visitors. It's not nice. The rubbish is, danger to wildlife. The fire damage is incredible. Absolutely off the chart now. What's the plan? Because it can't go on for another year. Because you talk about people being respectful and the sustainability of it all. That's not happening right now.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I'm just one stat from Andy Butcher. He arrives on Ullswater at Glencoyne at about 5:30, 6 in the morning. His first hour is spent collecting rubbish, and I think the record last year was in July. He collected 10 full bags of barbecues.
We did that the other weekend. We broke down an abandoned camp after a thunderstorm. And we are probably about 10 bags off of that. 2 tents, 2 airbeds, brand new duvet, mattress, all left. 2 bags of human feces left by the tents for me. Bags of shopping. Also, my dog has cut his foot open on glass on the shore this year. It cost us £400. I want people to come here and enjoy the Lake District. I did for years. Obviously, I'm not native to here. I've come here since I was a child. I've lived here the last 4 years. It is Ullswater itself is my absolute love, and to see it being treated the way it is currently is heartbreaking and devastating.
Thank you very much. Well, there you go. You wanted to add something to that?
Yeah. So, there was an illegal camp on Ullswater, and unfortunately a young man died. And we drove along the shore 3 days later. There were 3 campfires in the evening dusk, clearly visible, next to the signs that say no fires. And what on earth do the National Trust do? I think they manage that shoreline. Absolutely nothing. And just what the lady's been saying, that there's going to be a disaster one day, and it's not acceptable.
Let him, he knows this.
It's not about education. It's people that I'm confronting and I'm talking to and engaging with. They all know they're not supposed to be doing it, but they're doing it anyway.
But that's a good point for me to dive in, because I think the reason this is such a difficult issue to resolve is that, coming on to that, beyond education, when you get into regulation and enforcement, there are relatively few agencies that can...
That's all you can do.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to put it quite as bleakly as that, but yeah, you're not far off here. So if there's criminal activity going on, the only people who can do much about that at the moment is the police. The PSPO, if it was adopted in a similar fashion to Cumberland have done, would allow the councils to take more active enforcement action. Obviously there's resourcing issues to all of this, but they could then take enforcement action. The problem as things stand, even with what is really the worst type of behaviour at the moment, in the absence of police presence, The National Trust as landowner, they can't do anything, or they have no enforcement powers to move anyone on.
I've stood there putting fires.
Yeah.
And they said, the ranger said, I'm not allowed to put that fire
No.
out, but I can stand and watch you put the fire out.
Well, that'll be to do with trust policy, and I'm not saying I would have a different policy as an employer. The point I'm making is the idea that they've got the legal powers to require someone to put a fire out and move on is just not the case. It's the police, and if a PSPO order was in place. In terms of immediate short-term actions, we are increasingly aware of the issues around Ullswater. We have been for a while, obviously. The police are now, all credit to the local PCSO, is now coordinating a multi-agency day on the, I think it's middle of July or August, forgive me, I'll come back to you with the date. But we're looking to then improve and increase multi-agency patrols so that we do have the police and the fire service with us to try and tackle it. But I'll carry on. It does come back to the point of we as a park authority can increase our patrols, but our resources are also extremely limited. But we can increase our patrols, but we are not much better equipped than the National Trust staff to deal with it. What our visitor management officers rely on is engagement and encouragement to move on. And in truth, actually that does work a lot of the time, but there is still a hardcore that you can imagine the response our ranger gets when he or she asks them to. Yeah. But I do think increasing our patrols where we can would help, because you're probably in that 80-20 rule that 80% of people will move on and will try, and I think that is the case, because the 20%...
Once they're moving them on once they're camped, kind of defeats the whole purpose, because so many of them are there all night. And so you go down in the morning, you explain the rules, you say you're not supposed to be doing it.
But then the other solution somewhere locally like Ullswater is pretty difficult, pretty radically, and may not enjoy support either, because the sort of lay-bys up to and including Glencoyne Bay, you'd put big rocks in front of them and shut them off, and that's how you would effectively stop parking and camping on there. If that's the solution the local community wants to see, that's something we can discuss with the landowners, who are pretty much, I think it's mostly National Trust and Westmoreland and Furness maybe own a couple of them, I think, don't they? But
maybe we should...
We are getting into the realms of you need physical barriers to actually to alter this, short of significantly increased police presence or the PSPO. And I think the reason, I don't think Westmoreland and Furness are being difficult, it is the process and the time it takes to implement a PSPO. They couldn't hope to get one in for this season. Sorry, Tim.
No, just obviously it's going to absorb a lot of the energy of this room if we keep on this issue. Maybe you can advise us at the end, or maybe there's some information you can transmit to us, or what about how you plan to deal with this
and
issue?
I'm more than happy to stay on at the end and have some one-to-ones and conversations with people for that.
I believe Tim has already arranged a meeting with you and another lady.
Spot on.
Another Tim, yes, not this one. Tim Farron, presumably you mean, is that right? Yeah. Other topics, biodiversity, nature, anyone has other topics you like? I had a topic I wanted to talk about, if possible, the future of the Glenredding Common. It was a big issue here some time ago, then it sort of fell flat. There were various people involved in the area who were interested in trying to find a management strategy for the common, because the authority wanted to move it to another authority to take management responsibility for it. We don't know where we are on that. Has that debate come to an end? And what sort of resources do you have at the moment to address the management issues of dealing with Glenredding Common?
So yes, we were seeking to do 2 or 3 years ago was effectively offer a long leasehold in the common, and for those of you that recall, we went out to market to try and secure that. That's not the land management aspiration now. The common's returned in-house and is looked after by the Park Authority directly, and there's no intention to shift that currently at all. Quite the opposite. We're currently working our ecological and nature-based team, exploring opportunities for land management on the common and schemes that we could put in place. It's in the early stages at the moment, but looking at schemes we can put in place on the common for natural flood flood management and resilience to help improve the flood resilience of Glenridding Village and the wider valley effectively. So that's the direction of travel, looking at what we can do in terms of nature-based solutions on the common. In terms of the resources that we put in, it's broadly similar to the rest of our estate. We have a property team, we have our area rangers, we have our field rangers, so we're directly involved in maintaining the footpaths and the access rights across the common and doing the land management. I couldn't tell you the exact figures because we don't operate in quite the way the John Muir Trust. We don't have a dedicated ranger as such. We have a team, and individuals are putting different amounts of their time into that. But the heart of the question was, there's no plan to dispose of Glenridding Common, and actually what we're looking at is how we can improve the state of nature, and in particularly use land management on the common to improve flood resilience in the village and the valley.
Okay. Mark.
Yes, Mark Richards, culprit. Mark Richards, culprit guidebook writer to the fells. I'm very aware that you are responsible for the statutory rights of way, and you're very aware that the fix of fells are under considerable pressure sustaining their works, which is absolutely fundamental to the people who actually venture to the high fells, and it's a perpetual challenge to cope with the actual wear and tear on regular path system. And there needs to be some kind of long-term vision on how, because the paths, people are not going to stop walking the fells, but they're under constant pressure. So fix the fells need funding as well to keep that mission going, because that's one of the pulls of the mountain landscape, is the fact there are really reliable paths that people can follow and not have accidents on and so forth. The fells are part and parcel of the Lake District, not just the valleys.
Yeah. It's wrapped up in the same conversation for me around strategic public transport as well, actually. It's the same funding pot that comes through our two local authorities that supports the rights of way at the moment. And I think what we need is a funding formula that recognises the visitor economy, not just the resident population. Certainly the funding formula we've got at the moment, I don't mind getting into the detail of it. Effectively, the rights of way network are the statutory responsibilities of the two highways authorities, so Cumberland and Westmoreland councils. We manage and maintain them out of a sense of duty, pride, obligation. It's part of the fabric of the Lake District. We're passionate about the work that we do, but at its most basic, we're a contractor for the two authorities. We effectively operate under contract on a 3-year basis. We receive in funding from the councils about £150,000 a year to keep the rights of way network up in the Lake District, and we spend just shy of 1.5 million doing so. So we're putting 1.3 million of national park grant into that rights of way network as an organisation that only receives 5.5 million of central government funding. There's going to come a real pressure point, because the park authority, it'll get increasingly untenable to be spending over 20% of your budget maintaining the rights of way network. So when the current agency agreement comes to an end, we'll be having further difficult conversations with the two authorities, potentially with a mayoral combined authority, and I hope there might be more scope for meaningful conversations at that point. And that isn't a slight on my colleagues at the two authorities. I think they do a great job, but they've got their own funding challenges. The other areas that we need to start to explore is nationally, all 15 national parks jointly own a company called National Parks Partnership, and that's engaged primarily in looking at corporate partnerships and private sector investment. So at its most basic, effectively corporate social responsibility investment from companies for whom that relationship does good to their brand, but equally there are some more deeper contracts and different arrangements around access rights and things that we'd look to explore as well. So there might be an opportunity for more private sector investment. I think we probably have to get more ambitious and creative around grant funding in that area as well. The general public are incredibly supportive of Fix the Fells, so I think direct charitable giving will remain an option, but at its heart I think we need a different settlement with the two authorities or the mayoral combined authority when it comes. What I am proud of is the amount of money and resource that the Park Authority have managed to continue to put into the rights of way network in some pretty straitened times over recent years.
Miles, I saw your hand go up.
Sorry, that reinforces the argument for a visitor payment.
It reinforces the argument for visitor payment, was the question.
Well, yes, well, all the same argument before that we've had effectively. Yeah, there is that debate around what the transport funding settlement that we get is, and at that point then I think you are ultimately looking at a range of options, and our sustainable funding, transport funding group that I spoke of, that derivative of the partnership, is engaged in that work at the moment. It is looking at effectively visitor charges, in particular congestion charging, but there are other options it's exploring as well, including car parking surcharges, for example, or another way of raising transport related funding. Although I'm sure there's some pretty firm views on the price of car parking and whether it should be higher or lower already as a major car parking provider. But they're looking at a range of options, Miles. But effectively, vehicular charging is one of the things that they have been asked to at least explore.
I have a question from Zuma, which is, what are the LDNPA plans in terms of deliverables, and how will it measure success? Here you have a stack of different things, a long, long list of things you're going to do. How are you going to measure what you've achieved? And maybe an adjunct to that, do you have 2 or 3 particular issues that you have in your site that you want to crack in terms of your responsibilities? Or is it just an overview, all these separate trains of work going on, or do you have something you really passionately want to solve in terms of the challenges that have been
So we can split that out, some sort of personal things that I'd really like to see us make progress on, but this isn't necessarily position of the board or the partnership, but those of you...
Sorry, would you mind if the Zoom asked the question? Would you mind?
Yes, no problem. So some personal priorities for me that I outlined when I got the job were around agricultural transition. I would really like to see some sustainable funding options for nature-friendly farming that also respect the cultural heritage of the Lake District, because I think the existing options, when they are open through existing ELM schemes, don't necessarily achieve that. I would love to see the Park Authority, although we're not directly DEFRA, the RPA, NPE, we're not directly involved in this landscape. I'd certainly like to see us play a role in advocating and seeing change in that area. I don't have all the solutions at all as yet, but I'm really keen to work with partners to address the challenges around poorer visitor behaviour that are really apparent in places like Ullswater, in Wasdale, and nature recovery, and seeing an improved state of nature for the park is really important to me personally as well. And the final one that I'm really working with my senior leadership team to at least try and start to explore is what the potential and capacity in areas would be for larger scale park and ride in the Lake District. I don't necessarily see that as the typical park and rides that you see in York and in Oxford and places. The geography is quite different, isn't it? But I do think there's scope for looking at wider parking provision on the outskirts of the park and then trying to use public transport or dedicated buses to bring people in. And I think certainly the Ullswater is a prime example of somewhere you could achieve that successfully if you think of the potential carrying capacity public transport links in Penrith and the areas where you could develop car parking around there. Sorry?
If we could get a car park, it would be.
Yeah, and well, it wouldn't necessarily then require car parking in the valley itself, would it? That's the point.
That's probably where you're misguided slightly, because for a successful park and ride scheme, you need a bus service that works and it's in existence.
Yes.
Just repeat that. Sorry.
For a successful park and ride scheme, you need an existing bus service to link to with those car parks. Now, we've got a bus service, and we had a car park which has now been taken away from us. And I think if you go back to one of your very earlier points, you frankly said that cars are going to dominate in the foreseeable future, and we agree here. But the problem in Ullswater is that we've got very limited capacity for the cars that come in. There's 6 roads in the valley, 6 roads out, and when we're full, we're full. So what we're trying to do is to lessen the number of cars in the valley. But what we need to do that is somewhere to put the cars so that we can put them on our buses. Now, the car park that you've consistently refused permission for was on an existing hopper bus route, and actually other bus routes as well. Plus, it was on the Oldswater Way, access to the Emont Way, and it was right next to a pier. It's in a perfect position for us. So we're talking Waterford, yeah. And again, you know, having more people move around the valley by bus would again lessen the effects of antisocial behaviour, because if people are on the buses, they're far less likely to be antisocial, because by the very virtue of the fact that they're with other people as they travel around, the whole thing becomes a much more social event. So, you know, my question is, you know, is there any chance that we will, you know, that policy can be looked at, reviewed again? I know there's a lot of history to that, but really it is the right place for a park and ride for this particular valley. Thank you.
Well, first of all, that's not necessarily the park and ride I was necessarily referring to. It's more about parking outside of the valley and coming in on buses, and I don't necessarily agree, although you have to be realistic about what can be achieved in a geography like Cumbria, but you don't necessarily need a pre-existing bus service. The trials we've run in places like Wasdale are effectively about shuttle buses, and you create the demand and you put the bus service on. I'm not going to stand here and relitigate the Waterfoot decision. Effectively, it was effectively not policy compliant for a range of reasons, not least landscape harm. In terms of when we may review that policy, and this is not a commitment to change on that policy, but that would happen through the local plan development process, which is due to kick off at the back end of this year and then take up a good chunk of next year. In terms of car parking provision in the valley and in Pooley Bridge particularly, we're always, as a planning authority, effectively in the lap of the applications that come forward. I don't know yet whether the applicant for the Usemere car park will come back forward with alternative proposals, because that was recommended for approval by the officer team at Development Control. The members, as he's absolutely there right, concluded that there was landscape harm there, but whether there's alterations or mitigations in design that the applicant could make and come back forward. And there's also the Sun Inn, isn't it, the car park there as well, where we're awaiting further information for an application coming forward there. So there are possibilities of applications coming forward. It's not my job to comment on the process of Development Control Committee, but there are still the possibility of applications coming forward for further car parking provision in Pooley Bridge.
Can we take one last question, either from the Zoomers or from the floor? I think we've given you quite a task. Yes, Michael?
In your presentation, you talked about farming, and clearly the landscape of the Lake District is because people have farmed it for thousands of years, and that's what makes it so absolutely stunning. But my own experience of the Rural Payments Agency and the current government is, of course, they've just cut all the funding. So quite how all the people who live and work in forestry and other types of businesses within the park, quite what they're going to be doing next summer, I'm not sure, because at the moment there's no funding in place.
No, we are pushing hard and enjoying cross-party support with our local MPs on exactly this issue with central government. There is a real pinch point for local farmers. I genuinely think it has played an important role in shaping the Lake District. What gives me the most cause for encouragement is, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here in Ullswater, this is genuinely one of the best examples where you can see nature-friendly farming working hand in glove to deliver and protect local traditions, but also deliver real improvements for nature. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And it goes beyond James, of course. Danny and Maddie have helped a load of farmers. It's fantastic work. It needs sustainable central government funding through the ELM schemes. That doesn't necessarily need new funding beyond commitments beyond what was in the CSR. It's about the design and applicability of the schemes to upland farms and to the Cumbrian situation. And it needs consistency in the rollout and delivery so that they're not getting pulled in and out. What we're also keen to champion and explore is effectively bespoke agri-environment schemes for the national park. We think it's such a special place and its agro-pastoral tradition so unique and so special. We think it warrants either bespoke agri-environment schemes or at least bespoke options within agri-environment schemes to bring them together hand in glove effectively to protect the tradition, the hefted flocks, whilst also delivering outcomes for nature. We're pushing really hard with central government on that. Obviously it's not within our gift. You know that the lay of the land and DEFRA and Natural England and the RPA's role in this, but we're pushing really hard with that, and there are a couple of signs for optimism that I won't speak too fully about, but I hope we can bring some change to bear on central government policy in that area.
On that note, I think we should give you a break. A bit of a break. Yeah.
I didn't know there was a round two, Tim.
Well, I don't know. You said we were going to hang around a bit at the end. No, I just wanted to pose a question to you. As is our normal practice here, we ask people in the hall and elsewhere on Zoomers to make a contribution to this talk, to pay for some of the costs, but also to raise funds. We've raised, I think, about £2,500 a year for this type of activity, which is not bad, giving to charities and so on. Is there a particular body you would like to make your particular organisation or your speaker's choice as to which organisation would receive funding?
Absolutely. I don't know around the charitable status, forgive me, but if possible, I'd like the money to go to Situ and the work that's done here in the Valley.
I'm sure you get some smiling faces from Situ. We were talking about that in an earlier discussion. Very good. That is duly noted. My next task is just to tell you very briefly what our next talk will be, and then I'll pass the floor to Gordon, our chair, just for a word of thanks. So our next talk is going to be by Tom Lemmy, who is the peatland project officer for the Cumbria Wildlife Trust, and he's going to talk on working to restore Cumbria's peat bogs. And he'll be talking on the 7th of August, and it will take place in the Park Inn Memorial Hall in Pooley Bridge. So that's our next talk in August. I'll give you my personal thanks for your fantastic presentation and your outreach to people, but I'll pass the floor now to Gordon to say a few words. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you to everyone who's come and listened to a very engaging presentation by the chair of the National Park. So what struck me about tonight, pretty much, is I was sat there listening in on my microphone, listening to the word count in terms of which words came up more than other words. And it wasn't lake, it wasn't district, it wasn't national, and it wasn't park. It was authority. So in many ways, Gavin's got the best job in the world because he's in charge of the Lake District National Park Authority. But in many ways, he's got the worst job in the world because he doesn't have all of the authority that he needs to engage in his responsibilities. And responsibilities itself is a word that comes from response-able. And to be response-able, you have to have all the responses in place to do the job that you're expected to do. As Gavin said, not ours, but ours to look after. And so that really is the conundrum that we have, not just in this valley, but right across the national park. It's having sufficient resources to be response-able, to allow the authority to be an authority, and to do the engagement, to enhance, to follow through on the 2050 plan. It is going to be a 2050 plan, not a 5-year plan. I think Gavin will see to that. And also to enforce that plan. Our national park rangers are great, the National Trust rangers are great, but they didn't do those roles to be enforcers. It's, strictly speaking, not in their nature, it's not in their general nature, and I have a theory that if it was in their general nature, they're not the right people to do the wardening and all of the rest of it. No one becomes a ranger to tell people to put fires out, clean up your litter, no, you can't camp here. That's not what they join to do, and we will lose very, very good people if that's what we ask them to do. I would like to commend yourself for the excellent work that you do.
There is a core group of us that do a lot of this, but...
Do you have a name?
There's no point in complaining about it. No, we don't have a name. There's no point in complaining about it unless we're prepared to do something about it. That's how I feel, so that's why I do it. But there also needs to be other things shifting. I feel like it's a cultural thing, what's happening along Ullswater at the moment. It's like people, they don't care. They feel entitled to do what they like, treat it as they like, leave what they like. And that's a cultural shift. I feel like prevention is probably the answer, as stopping them before they're camping and setting fires and what have you. How we go about that, I don't know. I'd be happy to talk some more, certainly, and work with you along the lines of that.
Okay, we'll come on to that later. So certainly engagement, but fundamentally, to achieve that engagement, we need more resources. That's resources for all of the things that we know we have to do, but also resources for education and for gaining respect. So another key number that came, not a word, but a number, 18 million. That's the visitor number. Now, if we say, on average, they stay for 3 nights, 5 nights, something like that, and then you divide that number, so times 18 million by, let's say, 5, and then divide that by 365, and then add that onto our population figure, what would that do to help get us more resources? I don't know, but certainly for Gavin, that's perhaps something that can be looked at that would help us gain more resources. There's no silver bullet. I mean, you need boxes and boxes of silver bullets to help Gavin do his job. And I think we'll all agree, everyone in this room is here to help and willing to help if we're guided in terms of how we can help you, Gavin. So I'd just like to say, because not every chief executive is brave enough to stick their head over the parapet and come out and engage.
Not stupid enough, I don't know.
So I think a really big thanks to Gavin for coming out and discussing what his thoughts are, the job, the role that he has to do, and for engaging with us. And Gavin, thank you very much.